An 11-minute segment from Forbidden Planet that was never intended for theaters was removed by MGM in 1956.
And Frances and her pet tiger were in the scene. Censors were alarmed by a combination of strength, innocence, and an old legend. Few individuals were aware of its existence for decades. The scene clarified why, after Altaira's first kiss, the tiger strikes her out of the blue music. However, audiences in the 1950s found the explanation to be too contentious. A sinister secret regarding the movie's actual significance is revealed by what MGM concealed. Two matte painters who had never written a script in music before entered MGM in 1952 with a scenario they named Fatal Planet.
Alan Adler and Irving Bloch were not taken seriously. Back then, science fiction was seen as a place to dump low-budget throwaways, where companies sent their leftover performers and repurposed monster outfits.
However, the music in their pitch was different. It came from two men who thought in pictures rather than words. They viewed a planet as a platform for technology, stillness, awe, and terror in addition to being a physical location.
Something about it persisted even after MGM initially threw it away. The tide had changed by 1954.
The rise in television and the increasing interest in space were no longer being ignored by studio executives.
MGM decided to take the risk and give it another look.
After being taken out of a drawer, the dusty pitch subtly changed into the planet that would eventually be banned. Among the priciest science fiction ventures of its era,
MGM not only gave its approval, they placed a wager on it.
A genre that often just made ends meet with $150,000 to perhaps $500,000 was given between $1.90 and $2 million. The studio had more in mind than just producing a science fiction movie. Their goal was to make it better.
The set designs were created from the ground up.
Instead of fading B-list stars, the cast featured up-and-coming performers like Leslie Nielsen and in music, Frances combined with Walter Pidgeon's gravity.
Every dime was used to transform an unappreciated genre into something that people couldn't take their eyes off.
The business froze for a moment as a result of MGM's audacious decision.
Was it a new future or just a stupid risk? Executives at MGM even discussed the expense in whispers. However, the gamble paid off. It did more than simply recoup its investment. By demonstrating to studios that stars didn't have to be inexpensive to shine, it altered the definition of science fiction.
The story was originally set in 1972. However, the script's technology seemed too fantastical and unrealistic to be anywhere close to the actual timeframe. Thus, they propelled the narrative 200 years ahead, arriving in the 23rd century on a far-off planet known as Altair 4.
Shakespeare's The Tempest was subtly referenced in the main narrative.
Dr. Morbius turned into a prosthetic.
Music, Miranda was replaced by his daughter Altaira.
The creatures themselves were more than just monsters. Shakespeare's Spirits of Vengeance is one example of how the human mind developed them, drawing inspiration from the subconscious.
The picture stood noteworthy due to its subtle blend of pulp genre and high art.
It was more than simply spaceships and lasers.
It was about fear, control, ego, and power that were so ingrained in the brain that not even the stars could shake it. Fred M. was given the directorial position by MGM.
Music, Wilcox, who was not familiar with science fiction.
Lassie Come Home is his most well-known credit. MGM wasn't searching for a visionary to reimagine the genre, yet they raised eyebrows.
They were looking for someone with discipline who could manage a large cast, a large set, and a strict timetable.
Wilcox produced. Everything was stranger in the greatest way because of his outsider viewpoint. It wasn't shot like a science fiction movie by him.
He shot it as if it were Shakespeare in space. There were no winks at the camera, no nods to the audience, and no quips.
He took it seriously.
The strange storyline was grounded by that gravity. He maintained his attention on the human faces at the heart of the narrative while allowing the special effects to flourish.
Under screenwriter Cyril Hume, the script underwent changes.
He evolved the graphic notion created by Bloch and Adler into something more profound. The influence of Freudian psychology began to spread. The monsters evolved beyond mere danger. They turned into representations of desire and repression taken directly from Dr. Morbius's own thoughts.
Hume wrote more than just dialogue.
Literary, psychological, and mythological layers were added by him. The narrative evoked memories of prior pain, a dread of authority, and the destructive potential of knowledge.
Aliens weren't the only issue.
It dealt with the shadowy facets of the human spirit concealed behind a gleaming curtain of sophisticated machinery.
MGM asked Walter Pidgeon to portray Dr. Morbius when he was 58 years old.
He had played respectable parts in high-profile dramas for decades.
He didn't know what sci-fi was. He almost refused.
It wasn't the genre that made him reconsider. It was the promise of a story that was similar to The Tempest and a production budget of $1.9 million. At Wait, Pidgeon witnessed the story.
Camp wasn't there. It served as a warning. He accepted the role.
And by doing this, he gave the movie the necessary gravity. He used restraint to ground the insanity. At the age of 23, and Francis entered the set donning what would eventually be referred to as the first miniskirt in movie history. Helen Rose created her startling costumes. They were nearly 10 years before Mary Quant's fashion breakthrough.
The executives were anxious. The movie was outlawed in Spain until 1967.
Although conservative theaters retreated, the appearance persisted. Innocent, futuristic, and barefoot, Altaira rose to fame not only for her beauty but also for her defiance of social norms.
Francis became a part of the future rather than only wearing it. Commander Adams, the crew's solemn moral leader, was portrayed by Leslie Nielsen.
He was the straight man before he became well known for his comedic abilities. He had a strong presence on Forbidden Planet. He appeared as though he belonged on a spaceship's bridge.
What would eventually become Captain Kirk was hinted at by his job.
Later, Nielsen made a joke about Robbie the robot being the true star.
In a sense, he was correct.
Doc Oro, who discovered it too late, was portrayed by Warren Stevens. Monsters were his last words.
In 1956, monsters from the ID hit the ground hard. The majority of spectators felt the ID even if they had no idea what it was.
The death of his character was silent, off-screen, and terrible. The antique machine of the Krell broke him when he attempted to utilize it. It was made worse by Stevens's composed delivery of it all.
There was no monster out there. It was within. Music, the robot Robbie didn't say anything on his own.
He was voiced by Marvin Miller, although he was not given credit.
Frankie Darro, a stuntman, was inside the outfit.
Darrow had a limited lifespan. He was fired after almost passing out in the middle of the scene after having a few beers at lunch. Nevertheless, the movement and the voice blended together.
Robbie also gained immortality. He wasn't merely a device.
He was charming. There had never been a character like him.
Amiable, lethal, and enigmatic. Hollywood wasn't even the location of the movie's initial release.
It took place at the Southeastern Science Fiction Convention in Charlotte on March 3 and 4, 1956. Later, on March 23, Hollywood arrived at Grauman's Chinese Theater.
For a genre movie, that kind of release was uncommon.
Forbidden Planet debuted loudly with cinemascope and stereophonic sound, although the majority of science fiction films had modest premieres and were shown late at night. It performed at Grauman's for 6 months.
It was handled like an epic by MGM.
They didn't say score by when the music credits rolled.
Rather, Lewis and Baby Baron dubbed it electronic tonalities. They would not be recognized as composers under union regulations.
There were no instruments used by the Barons.
They constructed circuits. They broke stuff to create music. Feedback, loops, and static. Even though their work wasn't considered music in 1956, it nonetheless altered the norm. There were conflicting reviews.
Some critics were unsure of how to interpret it.
It seemed like a joke to the New Yorker.
Although friendlier, British critics were nonetheless perplexed. The creatures, the psychology, and the Shakespeare didn't all come together well.
While some saw color and robotics, others saw brightness.
However, the film's popularity continued to rise despite the uncertainty.
It didn't require immediate permission.
It was designed with the long term in mind. The movie made between $1.20 and $35 million abroad and $1.53 million in the US and Canada. This resulted in a modest music profit of $210,000 and a total of slightly about $3 million. It wasn't the smash MGM had hoped for, but it wasn't a bomb. As of 1956, it was the 30th highest grossing American movie. Honorable. The true story, however, was not the figures. Later was what counted. It was nominated for the 29th Academy Awards in 1957 for Outstanding Special Effects. It was unsuccessful. The prize went to the Ten Commandments. However, music, the trophy wasn't necessary for Forbidden Planet. The light drew its monster. It had painted skies. Its effects were odd, homemade, and useful. The nomination for the award was evidence that things had changed. There was a sequence in Forbidden Planet that attempted to explain something that viewers never quite grasped. It was eerie, silent, and significant. Dr. Ostro made a comment regarding Altaira and her tiger at the 11th minute. According to him, a unicorn could only be tamed by a virgin. He also noticed a similarity in Altaira's music, ability to confidently command and caress a mature tiger. The final cut did not include that sequence. MGM made it quite clear. The virgin unicorn metaphor was deemed too explicit by the motion picture production code at the time. The notion that a woman had mystical control over animals because of her sexual innocence. In 1956, they couldn't allow that to make it to theaters. Altaira's tiger turns against her when she first kisses Commander Adams. It doesn't think twice. The animal that used to lie calmly next to her now perceives her as a danger. There is no explanation in the final cut of the movie. Although it appeared to be a random act of violence, it wasn't. The part that was cut would have made it obvious that her control over the beast ended with that kiss and that brief romantic awakening. The second innocence is gone, just like in those old myths where the unicorn bolts. It's not simply danger when the tiger lunges. It has to deal with loss, change, and irreversible things. The only place that scene appeared for years was in a book. Before the film was ever released in theaters, Philip MacDonald's novelization of Forbidden Planet, written under the pen name W.J. Stewart, was published in 1956. The unicorn line was maintained. Word for word it was spelled out. How the tiger was restrained by Altaira's innocence. The majority of book readers thought it was only an artistic flourish. They were unaware that the scene had been captured on camera before being buried. No one outside of MGM saw any indication, music, that it had ever been shot for nearly 2 decades. There was a rule at MGM. Get rid of all the work prints. They did not want different copies of their films to be in circulation. They didn't want the public to see raw wounds. However, Forbidden Planet managed to get through. Music, the old work print was discovered in a forgotten repository in 1977. It featured the scene with the unicorn. It featured raw sound, alternating conversation, and many takes. The specific reason, music, was kept is unknown. Perhaps someone overlooked it. It may have survived because someone couldn't bring themselves to burn it. And everything changed when it reappeared. The work print was recovered. It initially appeared on a Criterion Laserdisc. After that, it was released on the 50th anniversary DVD and Blu-ray. Fans who had grown up seeing the theatrical production at last realized what music had been lacking. The tail, the kiss, and the tiger. Everything made sense. Altaira was more than simply an ingenue from space. She was a living metaphor. Layers of innocence, sexuality, and the unspoken boundaries Hollywood wasn't prepared to breach were all interwoven into her story. In 1956, there was another issue that caused debate. In one of Altaira's scenes, she swam by herself, drifting across the water like a dream. She appeared to be naked. Word quickly spread. In a science fiction film, Anne Francis appears nude on screen. She wasn't, though. Her bodysuit was the color of her skin. It was smooth, thin, and precisely crafted to resemble bare skin in the presence of light and rippling water. The illusion was too successful.
People in the audience were furious. Angry letters were written by morality groups. The movie was taken out of several theaters' schedules. MGM was forced to make public pronouncements about music. People didn't believe them when they said, no, and Frances was never nude. No, nothing indecent had happened. They were astounded that it was only angles and lighting. The cameraman, George Foley, had employed exact lighting, prevented seams, kept shadows out of frame, and allowed water reflection to conceal the edges of the outfit. He made music a scandal out of a bodysuit. The crew was astounded by how authentic it appeared. MGM aimed to push limits without going overboard. They managed to accomplish both. When MGM attempted to re-release the movie as a cat matinee in 1972, they omitted 6 minutes. The swimming scene had vanished. So were a number of flirty interactions. Anything overtly provocative. Despite having a G rating, the version that was released that year lacked the elements that made the film stand out. Kids' music saw the sanitized version for years. The original unedited version was not shown to audiences again until long later. Spain completely banned the movie. Forbidden. Planet was prohibited there for more than a decade. Franco's Spanish censors objected to that swimming scene and Frances's miniskirts. It had nothing to do with the spaceship, the monsters, or the words. The costumes were the cause. Her body was too exposed, and her skirts were too short. It wasn't until 1967 that the movie was shown in Spain. It was still seen as dangerous in Spain at the time, even though it had already become a classic elsewhere. And Frances was on the verge of dressing even more modestly. She was fully covered from the neck down in a silver lane jumpsuit designed by Helen Rose, MGM's costume designer. It even included see-through shoes, silver gloves, and a matching hood. However, it was tight, even though it exposed no flesh at all, and when Dor Sherry, the chief of MGM's music studio, saw it, he remarked, "No, too revealing. Too sexy." It glistened. That was sufficient to render it unacceptable. There was never any filming of the jumpsuit. There are only pictures of outfit tests. Most people were unaware of the technological achievement hidden under all the drama and hyperbole. The setting was a fake painted desert. On stage 15, a curved painting known as the 350-foot cyclorama was displayed. It appeared to be an endless, foreign landscape. However, the lighting and music have to be precise. The artificial sun utilized on set has to match the sun painted on the background. The illusion fell apart if the angles were off. 40 skylights, each with 10 1000W bulbs, along with 96K 10S and 192K 5S, were used by Foley to illuminate that painting. Because of their high power consumption, additional lines from other stages had to be run. An entire army of electricians was needed for only one backdrop. The spaceship then arrived. The entire set was filled with a 51 music M flying saucer built by Altaira. It was the size of an actual building, measuring 167 feet across. The cast was overpowered by it. As soon as MGM executives arrived on the set, they raised the budget. The final cost of the movie was $2 million. That was unprecedented for a science fiction movie at the time. The spaceship, however, was more than a set. It was a pledge. The stakes were heightened. Everyone was compelled to give it their all. It made use of 4 of MGM's biggest soundstages. That had never been done in a movie before. Each one contained a distinct region of the globe. The control center, the Krell lab, the spaceship, and the alien landscape. The stages operated concurrently. Crews built, filmed, and dismantled in overlapping shifts. The rotation was continuous. The synchronization had to be precise, and the standards were harsh. This wasn't your typical genre film. It was a glimpse of a different planet encased in a construction, music, site. They constructed a 16-foot plexiglass globe inside the spaceship. It was composed of an inner shell and an outer shell with bands of burning steel. Everything was reflected in it. Everything in the room, light, cameras, crew, bounced off that globe. They had to conceal individuals, cover equipment, prevent glare,
and mask lights in order to get one decent shot.
Just setting up one viewpoint takes hours.
On set, the globe turned into a gorgeous nightmare and a legend.
The Krell laboratory followed.
It was more than simply lights and wiring. It included more than 1 square yard of plexiglass, 12,500 feet of neon tubing, and 50,000 feet of cabling. It was operated by a group of 15 music electricians.
To make panels blink, lights flash, and circuits pulse as if they were alive, they employed 110 different switches.
They had to run cables from other stages due to the high power needs. Every switch was important.
Mid-scene, they changed color. Pulses were modified.
It was simply human grit, but it appeared to be alien intelligence.
In Forbidden Planet, everything was larger than it appeared.
The sets that depleted power systems, the outfits that incited riots, the missing sequences, and the hidden analogies. People watched the movie for a long time without realizing what they were missing. Its rediscovery, however, felt like accessing a locked door because of those spaces and those silent erasers.
MGM spent $125,000 on the construction of a single robot in 1956. Robbie was that robot.
He was not a background device. He was the focal point. The expense accounted about 7% of Forbidden Music, Planet's $1.9 million budget. At the time, the majority of science fiction films could not have imagined earning so much money for their whole production. That comes to almost $1.2 million when adjusted for today's value.
And it was all absorbed by something that didn't blink, breathe, or talk for itself.
Robbie, however, did more than simply stand there. Lights flashed as gears turned as he spoke, winked, whirled, and moved. He had a plexiglass dome for a head. There were pilot, music, lights, gyros, and revolving spheres inside. As though he were alive, everything moved in time.
The first person strapped inside was actor Frankie Darro. It wasn't glitzy.
The robot was 7 feet tall, made of rubber and metal, and its interior was hot, dark, and, music, oppressive. The head was partially electrified, and there was no ventilation. After drinking a few martinis, Frankie once attempted to record a scene and nearly knocked the robot over.
The studio didn't find it funny. Every move he made was agony. He was exhausted by every motion. And none of that suffering was ever depicted on TV. Robbie wasn't finished even after the movie. MGM sent him everywhere because they needed to recoup their investment. In 1957, he landed a leading role in The Invisible Boy. Following that, he was frequently invited to appear as a guest on television programs such as The Twilight Zone, Lost in Space, Columbo, The Addams Family, The Love Boat, and even More and Mindy. A relic that, music, kept coming back to. He was a walking Easter egg. He has new wires and paint at different periods. However, the silhouette remained constant. In 2003, he even appeared on the same screen as Bugs Bunny and Looney Tunes. The career was not a cameo. It was a second chance at life. He was referred to as Hollywood's hardest working robot, music. Robbie, however, was not just metal. He had regulations. He was developed by a character named Dr. Morbius, who gave him stringent instructions that followed Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. Don't hurt anyone.
Obey commands and defend himself, but never at the expense of the other 2, music, norms.
The plot was formed by these rules. Robbie declines to defend himself when the invisible ID monster attacks. His circuits shut off. He understands in his heart that the monster is a part of Morbius, which is why he is frozen. He is attacking his own master if he attacks the monster. It was among the earliest instances of a movie robot adhering to ethics in addition to directives. And it permanently altered science fiction. Forbidden Planet did more than just that. First of all, neither trumpets nor violins, music, were used in the soundtrack. Circuits were used to make it. There were no instruments used by Lewis and Baby Baron. They made their own machines. Just pure voltage, music, and sound. Without any strings or keys. It was the first film with an entirely electronic soundtrack. The music wasn't backdrop. It was the tension, the tone, the vibe. It wasn't even referred to be music by the barons. The American Federation of Musicians forbade them from referring to it as music, so they dubbed it electronic tonalities. It didn't count, according to the union, if people didn't play it using conventional instruments. Therefore, the barons received second-tier credit even after producing something revolutionary: music. It was a cruel procedure. They constructed circuits that could not be reused. Everyone had a distinct sound, character, and lifespan for music. They captured that last sound as the circuit eventually overloaded and died. The soundtrack included that death wail. After that, the baron had to manually cut and splice hundreds of tape segments. Just tape, blades, and hours of repetition, no software, no undo button. The noises would have been lost without her, although she later described it as a miserable work. Every piece was distinct. It was impossible to replicate anything. They didn't merely take an experimental approach. It had a philosophical bent. Music, the barons viewed machines as more than tools, motivated by Norbert Weiner's cybernetics theory. They viewed them as living things in their own right. Feedback was received by the circuits. They adjusted. Over time, they evolved. They all had beginnings, middles, and ends. Their robots became co-creators because of that belief. Before the circuit failed, each beep and screech represented a moment of life. The creature on screen roared as the soundtrack buzzed and murmured. It was not a man in a suit who was the ID monster. Disney veteran Joshua Meter did the hand animation. Frame by frame, each frame was drawn on translucent vellum. Months passed. Unless it got through the ship's force shield, the monster was merely a blazing silhouette that was hardly perceptible. It was untraceable, frightening, and unsettling. It was too scary, according to state censors. A few called for revisions. An invisible creature rarely pushed back like that. However, this one touched a nerve. Perhaps because it didn't exist. It was a concept. Freud had the idea. The monster was more than just a danger. It was the subconscious. The unrestrained anger, lust, and fear that reside beneath every intellect is known as the ID. Morbius was unaware that he was making it. The old Krell machine read his mind, but he believed it was secure. Not just the ones he buried, the ones he acknowledged, and the ones he didn't even comprehend. And those ideas turned into weapons. With the help of almost 9,000 underground thermonuclear reactors, the Krell had constructed devices that made ideas come to life. However, they never considered limiting the machine. Thus, the Krell died when their own unconscious anxieties manifested. Every one of them. The same event almost happened again in one night. Morbius employed Krell technology. And the monster reappeared when his jealousy flared. Robbie, music, was unable to halt it because of this. The guns didn't function because of this. They were attempting to combat someone's mental state. Morbius was the creature. And his denial, his pain, his longing. All of it strengthened the monster. Not even Altaira was secure. Everything revolved on music and Morbius's daughter. Her naivete and her developing relationship with Commander Adams. Something inside Morbius was pulled. Something twisted. He didn't say it aloud. However, the monster roared as Altaira kissed another guy. It was not summoned by Morbius. It was him. His subconscious battled for dominance. The anger, possessiveness, and jealousy all showed itself in the most Freudian manner. Later, the incestuous undertones were brought to light by film reviewers. The creature had no intention of hurting Altaira. It wished to keep everyone else away from her. And in the end, Morbius himself was the one who suffered the most.